Hey everybody, I'm Andy Wike, back at it again today with another episode of All Pipes Considered, joined by my good friend Kaz Walters from Laudisi Distribution Group, the U.S. distributor for Savinelli, Peterson, Cornell & Diehl. Kaz, thank you so much for joining us again. I really look forward to our January tradition of talking about new Savinelli series.
As do I. It's good to be here. It's like the highlight of my calendar.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad to be of service. So this year, Savinelli has done something slightly different than previous years. One thing that you'll notice is 2026 marks the 150th anniversary of Savinelli Pipes. To commemorate this occasion, they've sort of approached their new releases for 2026 slightly differently. We have a selection of brand new Savinelli entries, but only 3 series this year. So we have the Lunaria, which is Savinelli's sort of traditional, as they call it, novelty, their standard production new release for the year. We also have this year's collection pipe, which is a singular shape added to the portfolio outside of the shape chart in a range of finishes. And then we have a very special 150th anniversary project. That series spans 5 unique shapes, each corresponding to a generation of the Savinelli family. Over the past 150 years, Savinelli has been guided by 5 generations of craftspeople, of folks who are deeply engaged in the community, with the brand, with the product, and it's the real driver of the innovation that we see from the marque from year to year. So I think it's really interesting and cool that Savinelli took this opportunity to showcase that tradition and that legacy through 5 really awesome pipes that are added as a limited edition for this year. So let's dive into it. So up first, let's talk about the Lunaria. Again, this is the sort of regular production addition to the Savinelli portfolio for 2026.
There's always a template that they use conventionally with their annual releases, and Lunaria holds closest to that, with one of the releases typically being something inspired by nature. In years past, we've had things that have been based on pine cones, sea rocks. With last year, we had the Baco and the Sasso, which is stone and woodland themes. This year, carrying that tradition, we have the Lunaria, which is based upon moonlight. The actual translation is, I believe, moonstone.
Moonstone, yeah.
Yeah, and so it comes in a smooth and a rusticated finish, with the smooth being more of a rich reddish burgundy, the rusticated being a burgundy with some brown tones to it. But you have this proprietary acrylic, which I have spoken to at length in previous episodes covering the novelties.
That is another theme that Savinelli continues to just iterate on and come up with new.
And they're really the only ones doing that.
That's true.
You have a lot of makers, both independent artisans and factories, that will use interesting acrylics, but Savinelli's really the only ones out there like making their own, playing with those ideas, palettes, textures, themes,
and building a series around it, right? Like taking a really cool acrylic pattern or color scheme and then using it to elevate the forms that have lined the catalog for 150 years.
I mean, and I think that goes in hand with the novelty releases, novelty meaning new. Like this is something new, something fresh, but still totally Savinelli.
Right.
And here, with the Lunaria, I think they hit the nail on the head with their choice in color palette and texture. I just think of kind of like full moon behind clouds sort of thing going. You have this undulating kind of, to use a gemological term for moonstone, there's an adularescence, like a play of light. That's the billowing light that you get like in actual moonstone. And it's great. I think especially when it's paired with the warm stains that they chose with the briar. It's
it's a very cool, almost smoky palette to the actual acrylic stem, and I think the aluminum accent in between the stem itself and the more warmly stained bowl is a really nice buffer. Like you're able to go from these cooler, more smoky gray, blue tones, like you said, like moonlight hitting clouds. And I think that's a perfect descriptor for this. But transitioning from that to a much warmer, richer red stain, it's just a lot of balance, a lot of like very intentional juxtaposition that I think creates a very recognizable palette. Like we saw this with like the Oceanos and even Miele to a certain extent, right? Like being able to take this proprietary acrylic and use stain colorings and different finishing techniques to complement that palette and bring it further and create something that's more than a sum of its parts, right?
Exactly. And even though on paper, or if I was just describing this to you, you made a great point with the Oceano. You have blue mottled stem and you have a warm red stain. What differentiates these? But that's the dimension that Savinelli adds to their acrylics as well. This is a very feathery, billowy cloud, and more of a muted grayish blue. The Oceano is more like waves and this like really fine and more fluid rather than feathery texture and pattern, and a brighter blue that one thinks of seawater. Ways of describing these two different series that makes it sound like, oh, these would be like maybe too close or too similar to have two different lines, and then you put them side by side and it's like, well, they took a concept that was proven, people love the Oceano, and they have hit another completely out of the park with execution with something that most people may not stop to think about, and that is the interplay with the texture as well as the color.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, like that iterative process, right? Like, it's not just like, oh, we found something that really works. It's more just like, this was one of our best presentations. How can we continue to expand that or execute it in a different way? And I think the proprietary acrylic, the accents, the stained colors, like all of that is used to great effect. Okay, so next up we have this year's collection pipe. For those of you who are not familiar with Savinelli's collection series, it's sort of an opportunity for Savinelli to take the iconic sort of neoclassical Northern Italian style that have grounded them in the pipe community for 150 years and continue to iterate on that, continue to offer derivations or iterations of iconic forms in new presentations with modified lines or proportions. These are forms that are reminiscent of Savinelli's standard shape chart, but they typically exist outside of it. So this year's edition is a really beautiful sort of squat Rhodesian shape. There's not bead lines to the bowl. I think they've just used a pronounced waistline. So the actual effect is something more akin to like the 320 or some of Savinelli's more rounded apple-like shapes. There's a really bold, bowl-centric, neoclassical approach to the execution of this specific Anglo-French shape, right? And I think taking that a step further, Savinelli's actually incorporated one of their very unique, what I call like D-shaped shanks. They're not exactly oval. There's a bit more of a dome on the top of the shank than there is the bottom, but there is a very pronounced cinching to the actual form. And I think what that does in profile is it actually makes the form more slender and elegant.
I agree. So it's really cool. What they tend to do, you're exactly right, like reimagining or inspired by the shape chart without actually fitting into it in any one shape cleanly. It's a new approach. And I really like that they're taking something that looks like it could have been a Savinelli shape for the past 150 years, but it hasn't been.
Right.
And I see this as kind of like a reimagining of something like the 673 KS, which is an incredibly popular shape. But by softening the lines, not adding a bead line at all, so it's pure silhouette. And then instead of the triangular shank, giving it a D shank, you take all of these like really subtle changes, and even if they're not changes, subtle design elements, and it collectively, they make such a bold new statement. When individually it might be such a slight deviation or such a slight element. It's really cool to let this shape ride almost solely on the silhouette.
I really like that
And
perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's just, it's really well done execution, and like it's immediately recognizable as something that would be like a Rhodesian or a bent bulldog without being firmly in the box of that, because you mentioned the
Or two on the nose.
exactly,
right?
like
it's
the
not a
320
one-to-one
or
necessarily.
yeah, like there are elements here that remind you of an Apple or an Author, but it's just subtly in the Rhodesian bulldog family, and it's to pull something off with such understated cues and it still be neoclassical Italian. That's really impressive, because usually that school leans very heavily on bold. You talk about bowl heavy, and this is still bowl heavy, but
It's still quite elegant.
Exactly,
Right?
yeah.
Like it's not overly muscular. It's not chubby, as we often say. It has the elegance of a prince.
Yeah, it's like taking a lot of the, you were talking about the Anglo-French styles, and they lean on more subtle, understated cues.
Sure.
It's taking...
Same with Danish.
Exactly. It's taking that approach to shaping and applying it to like
Their iconic
Italian
signature
neoclassical,
style.
which is really interesting. I also love the, would you call that a half saddle, with it being on the bottom? So like it has a comfortable ability to clinch, but executed again in a way you don't often see. I mean, I've seen half saddles before, but to go that route with it further, I think creates a more bowl heavy presentation, but still keeping it balanced.
Yeah, I think as you said, like it really just ties back to the silhouette. I mean, like the half saddle there, it lengthens those lines. I mean, like the actual cinching, like the actual sort of eye shaped, and that's really what it is. It's really more of like an almond or an eye shape sort of shank than it is maybe a D. But having that half saddle there, there's more negative space, and so the eye follows the lines of the pipe a little better, I think.
And you saying almond or eye shape, that's another thing. We've talked about apples and authors and all that, Rhodesians coming into play with this. But I mean, right there you have a Canadian design element.
Yeah.
So it's something that wasn't immediately obvious, but makes a big difference.
Yeah, it's a really cool series. I always look forward to these and seeing how Savinelli is, you know, we talk about the Lunaria and how they're, you know, pushing the boundaries with acrylic choices and color palettes and different accent materials. I think the collection is Savinelli's series to do the same thing, but with shaping and forms. So really excited for this year's edition. I think it touches on a lot of the signature shapes that many of us hold dear, that are among our favorites, and it just executes it in a way that is very different from any of those singular elements. All right, then now we're going to talk about the 150th anniversary series. As we mentioned, it's a collection of 5 unique shapes, each named after one of Savinelli's generational patriarchs. So the first entry in the 150th anniversary line is inspired by Achille Savinelli. They sort of chose this very iconic flared bent Dublin shape with a saddle stem. You'll probably recognize this from some of Savinelli's earlier catalogs. I think it's really cool that they used this shape. It's very iconic. It's very classic.
Very Savinelli, especially very old Savinelli. And it's so interesting to me that they picked that to be Achille the First, or Achille Senior's pipe, because, little known fact, my first ever Savinelli was an estate pipe in that shape.
Oh wow!
So like that's pretty cool.
That's awesome.
But yeah, I think that is a very like old school Savinelli Italian. Like it's robust, compact, bowl heavy, as we referenced with the collection shape. I think it's a really cool execution, especially with the commemorative bands that they are doing.
Yeah, and we'll touch on those once we finish just describing all the shapes. But
sorry, jumping ahead. I'm kind of excited.
Yeah, no, for sure, I am too. But yeah, I think the bent Dublin form is as you said, very old school Savinelli. I think it was the perfect shape to sort of launch with, and yeah, a lot of different finishes available, and we'll touch on some of the accent materials here in a bit. All right, next up we have another sort of archival Savinelli shape, this time inspired by Achille Savinelli's son, Carlo. This is a a really nice bulldog. Once again, we sort of see Savinelli playing with that form a little bit. We've got, instead of traditional bead lines, there's just a pronounced waist that's high set, a really muscular short throw diamond shank and saddle stem here.
Your quintessential classic
Italian bulldog.
Yes, and yeah, very full, very robust, very hard lines with the shank, which I think is really, again, good execution that they took such hard angular lines with a diamond shank and paired it with a bulldog bowl that doesn't have hard defining bead lines. So yes, it is a more defined waist than you would say like have on the collection. Actually,
Sure.
It's a great example of those two styles of execution, but you still have that kind of fluid nature with something that is a very hard angled line. And again, classic Savinelli. I think that was a great choice to do for Carlo.
Yeah, definitely. Moving further into the generations, we have an exceptional, very classic, very Savinelli straight billiard. And of course, that is sort of inspired by Achille II, Carlo's son. I think it's really interesting that the shape that they chose for this is that sort of very iconic neoclassical straight billiard. It has a lot of depth to the chamber. It's but it's still compact. It's still elegant. It maintains the overall form and style of some of the most iconic billiards out there, but it's executed in a uniquely Savinelli way. The bowl proportions are a little larger. There's a wonderful elegance of line throughout the shank and stem, a wonderful taper to the stem itself. It's an exceptional example of how Savinelli treats this, like, what is the most classic
You
pipe
take
shape.
an iconic pipe silhouette, but it's larger in every way than its like hard dimensions would make you think. I mean, it's got a generous chamber. It's got really full Italian proportions, namely in the cheeking and how it's very sturdy. But it's not going to. It's not a heavy pipe.
Right.
It's not a large pipe. It's
Like I would say group 3 max. Yeah.
it's kind of like it takes up more space and has more presence than its diminutive nature would imply.
So as we move to the last two pipes on the rack here, the last two editions of the 150th anniversary series, we're stepping into Savinelli in its modernity. So the first one here is actually a brand new shape designed specifically for this edition, and inspired by Giancarlo, who was Achille the second son. I think this shape is super cool. It's like a straight yachtsman.
I was about to say, like, this is my favorite. I believe this is my pick. I may have to pick this one up in particular. It's got like that forward thrusted bowl that you'd see in a yachtsman or Zulu, but it's kind of billiard proportion, no outer flare. You've got an oval shank, but they elected to go with a straight stem. So all these elements with implied motion, but also this like grounded sturdiness. And it's a really cool balance of elements that they've brought together here. It's going to have you talked about modernity. It's going to have more of as much of as pipes can have a modern presence. It's going to have this like svelte modern aesthetic with, especially being clenched in the teeth. Like it has this just very streamlined implied motion about it that's really sharp.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I think like as you're looking through these shapes, going from the full bent dub one, which is like a very old school Savinelli form, to something like this, which is it's far more elegant of line. The long throw stem here and the short throw shank, I think, were exceptional choices. It elongates that silhouette and makes it seem like it's still an Italian pipe. It still has a very robust bowl, a decent chamber size, but the overall feel of this pipe, as you said, is more elegant. It's more slender. It all comes down to the profile for me. I mean, it's just very elegant. Like I could see this, picking this one up in particular in this dress finish, if for a more formal occasion, right? Like it just has that quintessential Italian elegance rendered in sort of a modern sensibility. I also think if you're the kind of person like me, and Kaz, I know you do this too, but who often hold their pipes like this, which we sometimes get made fun of on the internet, it's an exceptional piece for this because it just sort of fits in the crook of your finger super nicely. And I think it will be a great sipper, I think. And, as you said, I think the slightly sweeping transition here and the light taper to the oval shank just continue those lines in a really elegant way. So,
it's so great to see the progression through the years and what they decided to pair with it, and how it's all Savinelli, but still unique to not only eras, but like design styles that are in the Savinelli wheelhouse.
100%. It speaks to the evolution of Savinelli's design language.
And if we're gonna we're talking about Italian pipes, if we were gonna make comparisons here, like I think of something like this as being like the Colosseum, and this is more like Lamborghini, like in the like they're both
Milan.
Yes, they're both very Italian things, but like it just shows the breadth of how that can be executed in the factory's output and their designs, and the
diversity of inspiration, right? Like Savinelli is not just one thing.
No,
like it's not just proprietary acrylic and unique accents. It's taking quintessential Anglo-French shapes and rendering them in a unique, very signature Savinelli way. And I think that's exactly what we see with the Giancarlo edition. The last pipe in the 150th anniversary series is the most modern edition in terms of generations. It is inspired by Achille III. I think this shape might be the most unique design-wise, style-wise, of the progression of Savinelli forms that we see here. It was designed specially for this series. It's a brand new shape. So we see like a revival of sorts of some of these archetypal old school forms in the earlier generations. But then when you look at Achille III's pipe, it sort of takes into account some of the overall trends in pipe making and proportions that we see across the artisans and other workshops. There's a sort of a squat pot-like bowl, but there's a lot of rounded lines there. Like in the hand, it feels more apple-like, but it's just a bit squatter than you would typically think. The shank is also quite short, and they've sort of compensated for that in the silhouette with this sort of medium length stem. But I think the proportions there, particularly with the accents, just sort of take that neoclassical bowl-centric approach to design, but then just sort of execute it in a different way than what I would have expected.
It's taking an approach to pipe making that they've always used, but using it to bring something new. So whereas the first three shapes are preservation, conservation, longevity, established, timeless, the two new additions are going to be reincarnation, rebirth. Like you're taking the same materials and the same approach and the same thought forms and reinventing the output while using the same mindset, ethos. And so it's really cool when you look at the progression. And the first thing that I thought of when I saw it is like, oh, this is a new execution of a Prince. And I'm like, no, that's not. It's very Apple-like to me, but that's just because of the roundness at the front of the bowl. When you look at overall height and the abrupt stop, like, okay, no, it's almost like a rounded pot. And so,
but in the lines, I think you're totally right to call it a Prince. Like it's like in the proportions of the bowl and the shank and the lengthier stem, like it does give this sort of Prince-like appearance.
It's Prince-esque.
Prince-esque,
but it's something that it's like it's if you drew the proportions out for me, like on a piece of paper, I would go, oh, okay, this is a prince. But then in execution, like, no, it's reminiscent.
Exactly.
But it is something unique and on its own, like the abbreviated shank. Like I would think of a prince having a longer shank, a dramatic bend, whereas this is pretty much straight. And while not necessarily a requirement, I think of princes as being a little bit more full at the bottom of the bowl, and then having a more like just level cut. And this like goes up even further, like almost if you took an apple and compressed it, but not to the point of a tomato.
Sure.
Like I feel like I'm describing a mythological creature here with all these elements, but it's...
No, and I think in some ways that's totally true. And I think there's even like, you know, on some of Savinelli's quintessential forms, there's a slight bevel to the rim, and they've kept it a little domed here, which I think sort of emphasizes the like spherical nature of the bowl itself. What I think is interesting too is that it has a flat bottom, and so it'll sit nicely on a flat surface. And then, as you mentioned, it's a straight pipe, but there's the illusion of a 1/8 bend or a 1/16 bend, like this very slight.
This subtle cue instead of actually, like the stem itself isn't physically bent like what they would normally do in pipe making, but it's formed with having this upward like jutting curve. So while the stem itself is straight and did not have a bend put upon it, it was shaped in this elegant sweeping way that gives it an implied bend. And using again subtle cues, which seems to be one of the themes. Like they're really showing their chops here, how they can do just the slightest change and make something completely new.
Yeah, definitely. And we touched on this in the past, but I think all of these do such an amazing job of capturing that silhouette. I think Savinelli in particular is very, very good about treating the silhouette not as an afterthought or a consequence of shaping, but it is an intent when they're creating new forms, when they're, you know, iterating or expanding their design language. Like the silhouettes, the elegance, the Italian sort of refinement that we would expect are quintessentially tied to their pipe making approach. So it's really interesting to see this mix of archival forms with two brand new shapes that still accomplish the same thing. They still speak to these specific eras and generations of Savinelli, all of which are true and integral to the brand. But we see that as an evolution, as a progression. And I think it bespeaks to the future of Savinelli as well. Like you could see the progression of their design language over the course of 5 generations here. And it's exciting to like think about what that could look like in another 150 years. I mean, I'll be long gone by then, but it's an interesting concept to celebrate legacy, to celebrate tradition, and find new ways of bringing that into the modern context, bringing that into like our lifestyles and our preferences in 2026. So to recap here, we've got 5 unique shapes, 3 of which are archival, old school, sort of quintessential Savinelli forms, mixed with 2 brand new shapes specifically designed for this series. They're available in a variety of Savinelli's most iconic finishes, and even some that I don't know that I've previously seen in great quantities, like the dress finish here. What's interesting too is that they all feature these really ornate metal accents. Each of these metal accents is designed specifically for the form in which it adorns. So the bulldog one, for example, is a diamond shape and it's a bit chunkier, but then you see like a very elegant wedding band sort of oval on the Giancarlo edition, for example. So they're all sort of custom fitted, custom formed for the specific shapes. Again, getting back to that silhouette and that design language.
Something that complements, even if it does contrast, like you have with the sandblasted finishes. You've got something that is very sleek and high polished, and it also balances against the colors. you have the Savinelli logo, you've got the 150th anniversary
marque.
Yes, and they're in very high relief.
That's true, yeah.
And we didn't mention this as we were going through, but each pipe has the signature of the particular member of Savinelli that they're meant to commemorate.
Yes.
So each one, the stem logo is going to be unique and representing the
actual signature of the patriarch for which it was inspired. And I think that's an interesting, very authentic touch that really only Savinelli can do. On the 150th anniversary pipes themselves, Savinelli has used two different accenting materials here. So all of the smooth pipes will feature the band that you described, rendered in sterling silver. The textured pipes, rusticated, sandblasted, all of those will feature aluminum bands. I think the effect is very similar. I think the sterling silver, obviously cast from a jeweler's perspective, like you can speak at great length about sterling silver and all of its attributes and qualities, but I think it's another element that adds this sort of like aspirational tier to the collection. I think if you're a Savinelli collector and you want, the most collectible, special representation of these eras, having sterling silver on the smooth finish pipes, I think is a nice touch. If you're looking to add one of these to your collection, I think the aluminum bands are quite nice. They still capture the same aesthetic, the same high relief markings across the band. They all fit very nicely with the actual forms. Few marques can say that they've been around for 150 years.
Oh yeah.
Far fewer can say that 5 generations of their family have been responsible for that success and legacy. So I think adding the signatures, really treating these as microcosms of these specific areas and eras of Savinelli production, I think it ends up with this really compelling series that just sort of captures both the past, the present, and the future of this iconic marque that we all appreciate in this industry. So yeah, there you have it. Savinelli's new releases for 2026. Just a special shout out to the Savinelli team, and congratulations on 150 years of pipe making. The hobby would not be the same without the marque, and I think it's really special to be able to sit down with you every year, Kaz, and talk about Savinelli and what they're up to and what they're doing and all the wonderful, awesome things we have to look forward to. So thank you very much for your time. Congratulations once again to the Savinelli team. We can't wait to see what you all will come up with next. Make sure to leave a comment below and tell us what your favorite release for 2026 is. Can't wait to check those out. We'll see you next time.